Hello everyone, tonight we're going to Ashford Pier, a place where the sea never sleeps, and neither do the whispers. It's just past midnight. The wind has shifted, pulling the fog from the water into the narrow streets like a slow, creeping tide. The wooden boards of the pier groan under the weight of damp air, and in that pale light from the harbour lamps. There's a shape lying face down against the barnacle-covered supports. A fisherman, returning from a late catch, saw it first. At first glance he thought it was a seal caught in the low tide until he noticed the hair, long and black, tangled in the currents. It took only a minute for him to start shouting. Within half an hour, half the town had gathered on the shoreline, staring down at the lifeless form of Maya Carter. A murder mystery has occurred, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where you're from and what you do, so maybe you'll find someone nearby who shares your taste for late-night mysteries. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. Maya was 29 years old. She had only returned to Ashford Cove 2 weeks ago after years living overseas. No one knew why she came back, not even her older sister Lena. At least that's what Lena told police later. Witnesses said they saw the two sisters walking along the pier earlier that evening. They weren't holding hands, they weren't smiling, they weren't even talking, just two silhouettes moving toward the end of the dock, the tide slapping below. At 11:42 p.m., according to the coroner's watch, Maya drowned. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma followed by asphyxiation in seawater. But what caught investigators' attention immediately was the location. She hadn't fallen from a boat or slipped from the edge. Her body was found beneath the central pier, a place where currents don't normally carry anything from the open water. And then there was Lena. When officers arrived, she was on the pier in soaked jeans and bare feet, her hair plastered to her face, repeating the same phrase, "She jumped, I couldn't stop her." Her voice shook, but her eyes... Some witnesses say they didn't look shocked. They looked almost blank. By 2 a.m., the fog thickened so much you could barely see the lighthouse beams sweep across the water. The body was taken to the small brick morgue near the police station. Lena was escorted there too, wrapped in a blanket. The first inconsistency emerged within hours. A couple who had been fishing off the northern rocks told police they saw only one figure on the pier all night, someone pacing back and forth, talking to themselves. The couple insisted there was no second person. Still, the town was quick to settle on the simplest explanation, a tragic accident, maybe suicide. But Lena was adamant Maya wouldn't do that. She wasn't like that, Lena told the local paper. She was strong. She survived worse than anyone here knows. But as the tide began to rise again that morning, more questions bubbled to the surface. No one had seen Maya in the days before her death except Lena. No one had spoken to her. And in a town like Ashford Cove, where strangers are noticed instantly, that was strange. The police sealed off the pier for forensic work. Detectives noted a broken plank near where Lena claimed Maya had fallen, splintered wood, as if from a violent impact. There were also small, muddy shoe prints, not matching either sister. It was enough to shift the investigation from possible suicide to suspicious death. And so began a case that would haunt Ashford Cove for years, not just for its tragedy, but for the final chilling revelation about the Carter sisters. By sunrise, Ashford Cove looked like the set of a crime drama no one wanted to be part of. Yellow police tape fluttered in the salt wind. Seagulls circled overhead, and the town's only cafe served coffee in paper cups to uniformed officers who were already running on fumes. Detective Harris arrived on the morning ferry from the mainland, a tall man in a salt-stained trench coat with a face that seemed carved from driftwood. He had a habit of squinting at people, as though he were reading their thoughts before they spoke. And in a place like Ashford Cove, where everyone knew everyone, his outsider's gaze felt like a spotlight. His first stop wasn't the pier, it was the morgue. He stood over Maya's body for a long time, taking in the bruising around her temple, the faint red mark across her wrist, and the way her hair still smelled faintly of brine and engine oil. The coroner, a retired Navy medic named Paul Renner, gave his preliminary assessment blunt force to the head, likely from something heavy and blunt, maybe a dock cleat or steel pipe. She was alive when she hit the water, but unconscious. If the tide had been higher, her body might have been carried out into open water. We'd never have found her. Harris didn't reply. He simply pulled out a small notepad and wrote 3 words, "Not an accident." At the pier, Lena sat wrapped in a borrowed coat, her eyes fixed on the water, as if willing her sister to surface again. Harris introduced himself, his voice low and even. "Lena, can you walk me through last night, every detail from the moment you saw her?" Lena hesitated, then began. "She called me 2 weeks ago, said she was coming home, that she had something important to tell me. We met at my place." She looked tired. Not sick, just worn down. "Last night she asked if we could take a walk to the pier. She was quiet. I asked if she was okay. She didn't answer. Then she leaned on the railing, staring at the lighthouse. And then Lena's voice broke. She pressed her sleeve to her mouth. She just went over. I jumped in after her, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. Harris studied her for a beat too long enough to make her glance away. From behind them, a voice cut through the morning air. "She's leaving something out." It was the fisherman who had found Maya. His name was Ewan Brooks, a wiry, sunburnt man in his 50s. "I was walking back from the boat when I saw her in the water. But I didn't hear no splash, didn't hear no screaming. She was just there, floating like she'd been dropped straight down." That comment lodged in Harris's mind like a fishhook. By noon, forensics had more to report. The muddy footprints found on the pier weren't Lena's, and they weren't Maya's either. The pattern matched a pair of steel-toe work boots, size 11. Harris asked around, but no one in town seemed to own a pair. At least no one willing to admit it. As the tide pulled back, a uniformed officer called Harris over to the base of the pier. Wedged between 2 barnacle-encrusted posts was a small, rusted toolbox. Inside a hammer, a flashlight, and a single photograph, waterlogged but still clear enough to see the faces. 2 women. One was Maya. The other was not Lena. The discovery was the first sharp turn in the investigation. If Maya had been seen with another woman who looked enough like Lena to confuse someone in the dark, then Lena's account suddenly seemed less airtight. And for Harris, it opened the door to a far darker possibility that the night Maya died, there were not 2 people on the pier, but 3. That photograph, blurred at the edges, warped from seawater, sat in a clear evidence bag on Harris's desk for hours. He kept glancing at it between phone calls as if the faces might shift under his gaze. Maya was smiling faintly, her head tilted toward the other woman. The second face was pale, with dark hair tucked under a fisherman's beanie. The resemblance to Lena was uncanny at first glance, but when Harris looked closer, the differences were clear, the jawline sharper, the eyes a different shade, a small scar across the chin. By mid-afternoon, Harris had a visitor, Father Callahan, from the small, weather-beaten church near the bluffs. He wasn't there to offer condolences, he was there to warn. "You're new here, detective. There are things about this town you won't find in your files. Old grudges, old debts, people who keep secrets for generations. If you go digging too deep, you might find bones under every doorstep." Harris didn't flinch. That's my job." The priest hesitated at the door. "Then remember, this Maya wasn't the first to vanish from the pier, and she might not be the last." That night Harris returned to the pier. The wind howled through the rigging, and the old lighthouse beam swept the dark waves in lazy arcs. He traced the muddy footprints again, following them to the far end, where the boards creaked under his weight. There at the very edge he spotted something for the first time, a faint red thread snagged between two planks. It was synthetic smooth, the kind used in heavy-duty boating gloves. The discovery dovetailed with another piece of information from the coroner. Beneath Maya's fingernails they had found microscopic fibers, red and synthetic, a perfect match. But what chilled Harris more was the tide chart pinned to the wall of his temporary office. Maya's death had occurred at the exact point of the lowest tide that week, the one time when a body dropped from the pier would be trapped against the support beams instead of swept out to sea. That meant this wasn't just an act of violence. It was timed. The next morning, Lena returned to speak with Harris. She seemed calmer, her coat buttoned, tight hair, neatly tied back. I remembered something she said sitting across from him. The night Maya died, she kept looking over her shoulder, like she thought someone was following us. I asked, but she wouldn't say. Harris leaned forward. Did she ever mention the woman in this photograph? Lena's eyes darted to the image, a flicker of recognition, then a forced shake of the head. No, I don't know her. He could tell she was lying, but the way her hands clenched in her lap suggested fear, not guilt. Later that day, Harris took the photograph to the only place in town where news travelled faster than the tide the bar. Old fishermen and retired dock workers crowded around it, muttering. Finally, one man, his voice thick with whiskey, spoke up. "That's not Lena, that's Eliza Crane. Left town 15 years ago after her brother went missing. Folks said she drowned herself, but no one ever found the body." The room fell silent. And just like that, the mystery doubled. The fog rolls in thick from the ocean, swallowing the harbour in a pale, suffocating shroud. The salty tang in the air stings your nostrils as you walk the narrow pier toward the old boathouse, a long abandoned shack of corrugated iron and rotting wood that once stored nets, crab traps, and the kind of secrets only fishermen carry to their graves. The padlock on the door hangs broken, as if it's been pried open recently. You hesitate, remembering what the locals say, that no one should go inside after dark, not since the night someone heard screams echoing from within, and found nothing but a slick of seawater on the floor. You step inside, the air is colder here unnaturally, so your breath puffing in short bursts. The wood beneath your boots groans under your weight. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the siding paints stripes on the dusty interior. And then you hear it, a slow, deliberate dragging sound, not the shuffle of rats, not the creak of the building in the wind. This is something heavy being pulled across the floor. You freeze, straining your ears. The sound stops. You call out your voice, barely above a whisper. No answer. Your flashlight beam slices through the gloom, revealing coiled ropes, stacks of old lobster cages, and a wall of salt-stained buoys. In the far corner, a shadow shifts, not because of your light, but as if it moved on its own. The smell hits you next, damp wood rust and something sharper, metallic. Your stomach knots. You step closer, your pulse thudding in your ears. Above you, somewhere in the rafters, something stirs. The drag sound returns, only now it's accompanied by a faint metallic clink, like a chain sliding slowly over wood. You lift your light upward and a single object drops from the darkness, hitting the floor at your feet with a dull thud. It's a boot, old, waterlogged, and unmistakably belonging to the man who vanished last winter. Before you can react, the dragging stops. And then from deep in the shadows above, a voice you can't place, low, almost mocking, whispers your name. Your flashlight flickers. Everything goes black. When your vision returns, it's not because the flashlight came back to life. It's because something is giving off its own faint, unnatural glow in the far corner of the boathouse. It's greenish-white, like the color of phosphorescent plankton on the tide, pulsing faintly as if breathing. You take a step toward it before your instincts scream at you to stop. The glow flickers, revealing what's beneath a torn section of fishing net wrapped around. Something that moves. The shape shifts in the dark, long and slow, and you realize it's not a single object, but several bones, thin as driftwood, lashed together with weathered rope, forming the rough outline of a human ribcage. The air is heavier now, thick with brine, and that same metallic scent from before. You take a step back, but your heel hits something soft. Looking down, you see a pile of clothing soaked, shredded, and tangled with seaweed. And then the voice again, not a whisper this time, but a hoarse, rasping murmur. Too late. Tide's coming. You spin, sweeping the beam of your failing flashlight. The sound didn't come from above this time. It came from behind the wall. There's a narrow gap in the planks, just wide enough to glimpse a sliver of what lies beyond. Through it you see water, dark, sloshing, and much too close for a building that should be on solid ground. The floor shifts under your weight. The boathouse creaks as if the tide is lifting it. Somewhere beneath your feet, something large moves through the water, brushing against the supports. The vibration travels up through the floorboards into your legs. A single drop of seawater splashes onto your cheek from above. You glance upward and your stomach lurches. Hanging in the rafters, strung from hooks like some grotesque fisherman's prize, are more boots. 4 pairs, all mismatched, all caked in salt. Each one still has a foot inside. The voice comes again, this time from everywhere at once. Find him! Before the tide finds you, the glow in the corner swells, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The boards at your feet groan louder, then split seawater, forcing its way up in a sudden icy rush. Whatever's beneath the boathouse is rising, and it wants in. The rain had settled into a cold, fine mist that clung to skin and hair, making the entire pier gleam under the faint orange glow of the street lamps. Officer Callum Reed stood at the far edge, one hand gripping the rusted railing, the other flicking his flashlight back and forth over the black water. The tide lapped gently at the wooden pilings, but beneath that surface calm there was a tension like the air before a storm. This was the 6th night since Evelyn's disappearance, and the unease in Ashford had turned into something else entirely. The locals had stopped lingering by the cafe windows and had begun locking their doors earlier. Fishermen who normally worked past midnight now docked their boats before sunset. There was a quiet agreement in the town something was wrong, and no one wanted to be the one to find out just how wrong. Callum's radio crackled. "Reed, you're going to want to see this. North end of the pier." He followed the voice boots thudding on slick wood, until the beam of his flashlight caught movement, a small knot of figures hunched together. One of them, Detective Marla Keane, stood back as 2 divers in wetsuits unloaded a battered wooden crate from their dinghy. The crate dripped steadily, leaving a trail across the planks. The moment the lid was pried open, the smell hit sea brine and something else older, rancid. Inside was a neatly folded red raincoat. Evelyn's raincoat, but there was more. Beneath it, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, was a single object, a child's photograph in a silver frame, the glass fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. The girl in the photo was unmistakably Evelyn, but younger, maybe 6 or 7, and beside her was another child, a second girl. Marla's voice was low. According to her parents, Evelyn was an only child. That sentence hung in the damp night air, heavier than the fog rolling in. The divers explained they had found the crate wedged into a cleft in the pier's support beams, where the current would have kept it hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. Reed studied the photo. The other girl's face was turned slightly toward Evelyn, her expression neutral, but her eyes, there was something about her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a stranger. Marla pulled a thin envelope from the bottom of the crate. Inside was a page from an old notebook, the paper brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was small, cramped. She doesn't know she's mine. She can never know. But she remembers the water, no signature, no date. The detective in Marla wanted to dismiss it as a hoax, someone stirring up a small-town panic for their own sick thrill. But the careful preservation of the crate, the hidden location, the personal items, it all suggested planning. This wasn't random. The mist thickened, swallowing the end of the pier in a pale blur. From somewhere beneath them came a hollow thump, like wood, striking against wood, carried up through the water. Callum leaned over the railing, but saw only darkness and the faint swirl of the tide. "Let's get this back to the station," Marla said, her tone clipped. "And keep this between us for now." But keeping it quiet in Ashford was impossible. By morning, whispers were everywhere. The red coat found in the crate, the second girl in the photograph, the note that sounded like a confession. Some swore they'd seen Evelyn with a shadow sister years ago, a quiet child who never spoke. Others claimed it was all the work of the Ashford Pier legend, the story of a drowned child who returned to claim another in her place. The police department received 3 anonymous calls that day. 2 were rambling nonsense heavy with static and the sound of waves. But the third was different. A woman's voice trembling, "You have to stop looking for her. She's not the one you lost." When the call was traced, it led to a payphone outside a shuttered bait shop, 5 miles down the coast. That night, Callum found himself walking the pier again, the photograph burned into his mind. He had grown up in Ashford. He knew every family, every story. But there was nothing, no record, no rumour of Evelyn ever having a sister. Still, when he closed his eyes, he could almost see the second girl standing at the edge of the pier, hair plastered to her face, eyes too steady for a child. The tide rose higher, slapping at the beams. Somewhere out there in the fog, something was watching, and for the first time in his career, Officer Callum Reed wasn't sure if what he was hunting was entirely human. The storm came in fast that night, wind slicing through the harbour like a blade. By the time Officer Callum Reed stepped out of the station, the streets were already slick puddles reflecting the erratic flash of the lighthouse beam sweeping the water. He wasn't supposed to be working this late, but the call had come in from a dockhand named Warren Hale, one of the few in town who still worked the pier after dark. His voice had been shaky words clipped by static. "There's someone out here. Just standing. Right where we pulled the crate up." Reed grabbed his coat and headed straight for Ashford Pier. By the time he arrived, Warren was nowhere in sight. The wind roared through the rigging of the moored boats, turning ropes into whining strings. Rain pelted his face as he jogged toward the north end, the same stretch where the divers had made their discovery. And then he saw her. A slim figure, hair plastered to her cheeks, wearing the same red raincoat from the crate. She stood at the very edge, back to him, hands loose at her sides. The beam of the lighthouse passed over her, painting her in pale white light for half a second. And then she was shadow again. "Evelyn," his voice caught in his throat. No response. He stepped closer, boots slamming on the wet boards. The smell of salt and rot thickened. His hand went to the radio clipped to his belt. Keen, I've got a visual at the north. The figure jerked her head slightly to the side, not turning, but just enough for him to see the glint of an eye. It wasn't the flat, panicked look of someone lost. It was intent, and then she moved. Not toward him, not away, just forward into the black water with no splash, no sound. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. Reed sprinted to the railing and leaned over, flashlight beam slicing through the rain. Nothing, only the restless slap of the tide against the pilings. Then a voice, not Evelyn's, from somewhere below the pier, muffled but close. She's not yours to bring back. The hair on his neck prickled. He swung the beam downward and caught the barest glimpse of movement under the pier. 2 pale hands gripping one of the beams before slipping into the water. Shouts echoed behind him, 2 officers running full tilt from the shore. He waved them over, but the water was already empty, ripples fading into the storm. When they pulled Warren Hale's body from the shallows an hour later, his eyes were wide open, mouth full of seawater, and clutched in his fist was something impossible, the silver frame from the crate glass gone photograph missing. Reed knew then the investigation wasn't about finding Evelyn anymore. It was about stopping whatever had taken her before it decided Ashford needed another. The storm wasn't just bad now, it was violent, like the sea itself wanted to swallow Ashford whole. Officer Reed didn't bother going back to the station. He kept his coat pulled tight rein, plastering it to his frame, and ordered the 2 responding officers to start a perimeter sweep. No one was going home tonight. By midnight, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The lighthouse beams struggled to cut through the sheets of water sweeping the pier in long, desperate arcs. The air smelled of brine and electricity, and every few seconds a violent wave slammed the shore hard enough to rattle the wooden planks under his boots. From somewhere in the black water, a thunk echoed up from beneath the pier. Not the crash of debris, more like the sound of a heavy door closing underwater. "Under the pier! Go!" Reed shouted. The 3 officers split Reed, moving straight down the main dock, while the others took the side ramps. He'd barely made it 20 steps before he froze. There it was again, her, Evelyn, red raincoat hair, slick with seawater, standing at the far end, with her back to him. Same posture, same stillness. But something about her was wrong. Her reflection in the puddled boards didn't match her movements. It lagged, as though the water was remembering her a few seconds too late. "Evelyn," his voice cracked in the wind. This time she turned fully. Her face was pale, too pale, and her lips moved in slow, soundless shapes. Then she began to walk toward him, not run, not stagger, walk. Reed took a step forward, his hand going for the flashlight, but then her head twitched violently to the side. Her eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed and her mouth opened, wide. From the black water beneath the pier, pale hands shot up between the planks, grabbing for his ankles. He kicked hard boot, connecting with something soft but unyielding, and heard a hiss of breath below. His flashlight beam darted downward, illuminating a soaked, grey-skinned man clinging to the pier's underside. His eyes were black pits, and in his teeth, a strip of red fabric. The sound that came out of him wasn't human, a low, guttural rasp that vibrated in Reed's chest. "Gun out now!" Reed backed up, firing once into the planks. The man let go, vanishing into the churning water, leaving only bubbles and a faint smear of blood. When Reed looked up again, Evelyn was gone. The radio on his belt screamed with static, but in between the bursts he swore he could hear words. "You can't take her from the tide." Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat the whole pier was lit up enough for him to see shapes in the water. Not one. Not 2. At least half a dozen circling beneath their pale faces, breaking the surface before sinking again. And in the middle of them, Evelyn motionless, her red coat blooming in the storm like a warning flag. Reed didn't hesitate. He dropped the gun, tore off his coat, and dove. The water closed over his head with the weight of stone salt and cold burning his lungs instantly. Shapes brushed against him, arms, legs, something slick and rope-like. He kicked toward the red-reaching fingers grazing fabric. Something yanked him down hard. When the officers found him washed up against the rocks minutes later, coughing up seawater, the red coat was gone. By dawn, Ashford Pier looked like something from another world. The storm had chewed the shoreline raw, ripping planks free and scattering them like bones. Fishing nets lay shredded across the beach, tangled with kelp and bits of clothing no one could identify. The rescue crews called off the search at 5:42 a.m. Official reason zero visibility and hazardous currents. Unofficially, nobody wanted to be in that water after what Officer Reed had said he'd seen. He sat in the station's infirmary, now hair still damp, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't helping. Every few minutes his eyes would flick toward the window, as though he expected something to be watching. "Tell me again," said Detective Marlowe, flipping open her notebook. "I told you twice already," Reed rasped, voice raw from seawater. "Then tell me a third time." He did, about Evelyn's reflection moving wrong, about the pale hands, about the man with black eyes and the strip of red fabric, and the circle in the water. When he finished, Marlowe didn't write anything for a long time. "You know," she said finally, "there's an old story about Ashford Pier. 1886, a group of fishermen swore the tide pulled their boats into a whirlpool, said they saw faces in the water. Some of them never fished again." "Folklore," Reed muttered. "Maybe. But every 20 years or so there's another story. Always in a storm, always someone missing." She closed the notebook. "And there's something else you might want to see this." She slid a damp, grainy photo across the table. It was taken from the shoreline, probably by one of the search volunteers. The lighthouse beam had caught the water in mid-sweep, illuminating a group of pale figures just beneath the surface. One of them was wearing a red coat. That same morning, townsfolk began reporting strange things. Boats found adrift with no crew. Fish washing ashore in neat, almost deliberate piles. The bell at the end of the pier, ringing by itself, though the wind had died. By nightfall, panic had spread. Some families boarded up their houses, others packed what they could and fled inland. Those who stayed spoke in hushed tones about the tide people and how Evelyn had been taken in. Marlowe wasn't ready to call it superstition. She and Reed patrolled the pier again, armed with floodlights keeping watch on the black water. The beam swept left, nothing right. Something broke the surface. Not Evelyn, not human. Taller than a man draped in wet, glistening strands that might have been hair, or seaweed with a mouth that opened too wide to be real. It didn't lunge, it just stood there in the water watching and smiling. Lightning flashed, and for a split second Reed saw dozens of smaller heads breaking the waves behind it, all of them turning toward the pier. The tide was coming in, and it was bringing company. The first scream came from the north end of the pier, not a startled cry, a deep, throat-tearing scream that made every head whip around. Reed ran toward it, flashlight beams slicing through the rain. He caught sight of Jacob Weaver, one of the older fishermen, halfway over the pier's edge. Something had wrapped around his leg, something slick and white, and was hauling him toward the black water. "Hold on," Reed lunged, grabbing Jacob's arms. The old man's fingers clawed at the wet planks, leaving splinters under his nails. From beneath the surface, shapes moved fast, coordinated like a school of predators. Pale arms reached up in unison. Pull Marlowe was there suddenly, her grip iron around Jacob's jacket. Together they wrenched him free, sending him crashing onto the pier. But the thing below didn't retreat. It rose. A figure emerged, waist-deep, skin like moonlight eyes, like tide pools at midnight. Its mouth stretched wider, and the sound that came out wasn't human, a churning, gurgling roar that made the wood beneath them vibrate. Then came the others. Dozens, maybe more, breaching the surface in a jagged line. Their movements were too precise, like soldiers advancing. The tide surged forward, licking over the pier's edge. The air stank of brine and rot. "Back, everyone, back!" Marlowe shouted, but a wave taller than a house slammed against the pier, scattering people like toys. Reed hit the planks hard, the flashlight spinning away. Cold water swallowed him to the chest, and something coiled around his waist, pulling down. He fought, kicking, punching. His fist connected with something soft but unyielding. A face loomed inches from his, not Evelyn's, but close enough to twist the knife in his gut. Same hair, same jawline, only the eyes were wrong, black, endless. "You shouldn't be here." It hissed, though the lips barely moved, and then it yanked. Reed went under. The world became soundless pressure, murky shapes darting in every direction. Fingers scraped his throat. He bit down on panic, clawing toward the surface, but every time he rose, more hands dragged him back. A burst of light cut through the dark, a flare gun fired from the pier. Red light spilled across the water, and for a heartbeat the creatures froze. Their pale faces turned toward the glow like moths to flame. Reed broke the surface, gasping, and Marlowe's hand clamped around his collar, dragging him up and over. The flare fizzled out. Silence. Then the bell at the pier's end rang once, slow and deliberate. The tide people were gone, for now. For 20 whole minutes after the creatures vanished, the pier was nothing but groans, dripping boots, and the creak of timbers in the wind. People stared out over the water like it might suddenly solidify and give back what it had taken over the years. Evelyn Jacobs' missing son, the nameless others who'd simply walked into the tide and never returned. Marlowe's voice cut through. "We can't stay here. Move." Reed staggered after her, lungs still burning from the salt water. Behind them, the bell at the end of the pier swung lazily, though no wind touched it. The townsfolk herded into the Ashford boathouse, slamming the heavy double doors and bolting them shut. Lanterns cast jittery light on faces pale, wet, and frightened. The air inside smelled of ropefish oil and damp wool. What were those things? Jacob's voice was rough, ragged. "I saw her. It looked like my boy, but wrong." "They wear the faces," Marlowe said flatly. "Always have." Reed caught her gaze. "You've seen them before." A long pause. "Since I was 9. I watched them take my sister." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the unspoken, that the line between memory and madness was paper-thin here. Suddenly the boards overhead groaned. A heavy thud echoed through the rafters. Reed's hand went to the flare gun. "They're on the roof, no." Marlowe's eyes were locked on the floorboards. "They're under us." The first plank cracked. A pale hand shot through the gap, fingers like wet driftwood nails scraping across the boathouse floor. More hands followed, splintering the boards in a jagged circle. The lantern light made the water below look bottomless, churning with shapes. Reed fired the flare into the opening. The room filled with blinding red, the heat scorching the closest arms. The creatures recoiled, but the hole they'd made didn't close. Upstairs, Marlowe shouted. The group scrambled up the narrow stairwell to the loft, dragging Jacob, who could barely walk. They slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved a crate over it, but already the walls began to tremble, not from footsteps, but from the tide itself, slamming against the boathouse supports. Outside, the bell at the pier began ringing again. Fast, frenzied, the creatures weren't breaking in, they were calling something bigger. From the loft window, Reed saw it, a swell rising from the black water, far taller than any wave had a right to be. And beneath its surface, a shape the size of the boathouse moved with terrifying grace. "Whatever that is," Marlowe said quietly, "it's not here for the pier." Her eyes met Reed's. "It's here for us." The wave didn't break. It rose higher, folding the moonlight into its ridge, and then simply stood there, a wall of water holding its breath. Something vast shifted beneath it, a slow rotation as if the sea itself were turning over. Reed felt the boards under his boots quake with every subtle movement. "We need to get out now," where Jacob rasped. His face was grey, not from fear, but from the cold that had sunk into his bones. The piers gone, the roads flooded. Marlowe's hand shot toward the far corner of the loft. "There's a maintenance ladder to the lighthouse. If we can get inside." The sentence died in her mouth as the boathouse roof peeled upward. It didn't explode or splinter. It simply lifted away plank by plank in the same slow, deliberate way a person might remove the lid of a box. The cold night air rushed in, full of brine and something older than rot. The flare's dying glow revealed a single pale eye the size of a cartwheel hovering just above the torn rafters. The pupil contracted in a smooth serpentine ripple, focusing directly on Reed. "Don't move," Marlowe whispered. It blinked. The sound of it, a wet snapping suction, made Jacob gag. Then came the voice. It didn't pass through their ears. It arrived fully formed in their minds, dripping with cold certainty. "Return what was taken." Reed's throat tightened. "We don't have anything." The voice deepened, echoing inside their skulls until it was almost unbearable. "Return, or be replaced." A sudden crash from below the trapdoor had been ripped away. Water poured up from the hole, not flooding, but reaching, forming tendrils that curled toward the loft. The water wasn't spilling in naturally, it was climbing. Marlowe fired the last flare into the creature's eye. The red glare seared across its surface, forcing it back just enough for Reed to pull Jacob toward the ladder. The climb was chaos boots slipping on wet metal rungs, the air thick with the smell of algae and rust. Below, the tendrils followed, weaving through the ladder's frame like living ropes. They burst into the lighthouse's service room. The space was narrow, its walls streaked with salt, and the main stair spiraled upward into shadow. Reed slammed the hatch shut behind them, wedging a crowbar across the latch. The pounding came almost instantly, the water slamming into the metal from beneath, trying to batter its way in. Marlowe's voice was ragged now. "It's not after us, it's after the one who's missing." Jacob stared between them, realization dawning. "Evelyn." Reed shook his head. "She's been gone 15 years. Marlowe's eyes were cold. Not to them. The pounding stopped. Silence swept the lighthouse. Then from far above came the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice calling Jacob's name. It wasn't faint, it was just upstairs. Jacob didn't wait. He was halfway up the spiral stairs before Reed could grab his arm boots ringing against the metal steps. The sound of the voice was too clear, too warm, too much, like the way Evelyn used to call him from the dock on summer evenings. Jacob stopped. Reed's voice cracked against the stone walls. "That's not her." But Jacob didn't stop. The lighthouse spiraled in tight circles, each turn revealing just another stretch of shadow. The air grew warmer as they climbed, the tang of salt giving way to something sweeter, a faint perfume, floral but wrong, like blossoms left too long in stagnant water. Marlowe followed close behind Reed, her flare gun empty, but her knife drawn. "It's imitating her. That's how it works. Don't let it touch you." Above, the voice called again. "Jacob, it's so dark down there. Help me. He was running now." Reed reached for the revolver at his hip, hating the weight of it. He'd never pointed a gun at a friend before, but Jacob was about to throw himself straight into something they couldn't fight. They reached the top platform, the lantern room. The great Fresnel lens loomed overhead, fractured and dark. The moonlight poured in from broken panes, making the wet floor glisten. In the center of the room stood Evelyn. She was barefoot, her dress the same pale blue she'd worn the night she vanished, but her skin was almost translucent, and her hair floated gently in the air as if she were underwater. Jacob slowed, breath hitching. Eve. She smiled, and for an instant it was perfect. The sister he'd lost, the girl Reed remembered waving from the pier. Then her eyes shifted. No whites, no irises, just that same pale cartwheel-sized pupil they'd seen in the water, now compressed into human shape. Marlowe hissed back. The thing tilted its head, and the glass panes around them began to weep seawater. It streamed down in rivulets, pooling at their feet, moving with purpose. The smell of deep ocean filled the air. "Come home, Jacob," it whispered. But the voice was inside all their heads now. "The tide is waiting." Reed fired. The bullet shattered a section of the lens behind it, spraying shards across the floor. The creature staggered, flickering like a faulty film reel, one frame Evelyn the next, a gaping spiral of flesh and water. The lighthouse shook. Below they could hear the pounding of waves against the stone, harder and harder, as if the sea were trying to climb inside. Jacob screamed, not from pain, but from the pull. Something invisible was dragging him toward her. His boots scraped against the wet floor, his hands clawing at the railing. Reed lunged forward, grabbing his jacket, feeling the strain in his own shoulders, as if they were wrestling gravity itself. Marlowe slashed at the water, pooling around Jacob's legs. It recoiled like something alive, hissing in a language none of them understood. The thing wearing Evelyn's shape was no longer smiling. It leaned forward, its voice a low, shuddering rumble. "Then I'll take you all." The lighthouse windows exploded inward. The black water came with them. The world went sideways. Glass metal and freezing black water punched through the lantern room, slamming all three of them against the walls. The roar of the sea drowned out their screams. For a moment Reed couldn't tell if they were above water below it or spinning in some impossible middle. Something hit his ribs, Jacob's shoulder, then Jacob was yanked away as though on a leash. Reed's hands shot out, grabbing air, then catching the rough fabric of Jacob's jacket. The water wasn't just flooding in, it was pulling, not down, not out to sea, but deeper into itself, like there was a hollow inside the tide. Marlowe surfaced near the broken lens, gasping hair plastered to her face. She still had the knife in her fist, though she was half underwater. "Don't let it take him!" she shouted the words, breaking apart in the churn. Reed's boots scraped uselessly against the slick metal floor. He had one arm hooked around the railing, the other locked on Jacob, who flailed in the current. Every few seconds, Jacob's face flickered between panic and something else. A calm, almost blissful look, as if he could see Evelyn just beyond Reed's shoulder. "Jacob, look at me!" Reed bellowed, salt water burning his throat. "It's not her." A shadow moved beneath the surface, massive, coiling the size of the lighthouse itself. Reed caught glimpses, a spiral mouth, rings of teeth, and in the center, a pale human face that shifted shape with every blink. Evelyn, his own father, Marlowe. The pull grew stronger, his shoulder felt like it would dislocate. Marlowe dove. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone, vanishing into the black swirl around Jacob's legs. Reed held his breath, counting 1, 2, 3. Then she burst up again, dragging something like a length of eel or rope in her free hand. No, not rope, a tendril. It writhed in her grip, trying to coil around her wrist. She jammed the knife through it. The thing shrieked, not in the air, but inside their skulls, and let go of Jacob. The pull slackened, just for a second. Now Marlowe roared. Reed hauled Jacob toward the shattered opening where the lantern glass used to be. The storm outside was a frenzy of foam and lightning. Waves pounded the side of the lighthouse, reaching far higher than they should. They jumped. The fall was brief and brutal, the ocean like a wall when they hit. Reed lost all sense of direction, only the burning need for air telling him which way was up. He clawed for the surface, found it, and gasped. Jacob surfaced beside him, coughing but conscious. Marlowe appeared next, dragging herself onto a chunk of floating wreckage part of the lighthouse balcony. "Swim!" she shouted, the currents shifting. Behind them, the top of the lighthouse leaned, groaned, and with a final, echoing crack, collapsed into the black water. For a heartbeat, the sea was calm. Then a single ripple spread outward, wider and wider, though there was no wind. At its center, something pale rose just above the surface, a human face smiling, its mouth opening far too wide. It spoke one word in Evelyn's voice: soon. Lightning tore across the sky, and when the flash faded, the face was gone. They were alone in the dark water, Greywater Cove behind them, and something still out there in the deep. The rain had stopped hours ago, but Ashford Pier was still slick with seawater, the planks groaning under the weight of every step. The moon hid behind thick clouds, offering only a thin ribbon of light enough to paint the waves in shades of dull silver. Daniel stood at the very edge of the pier, staring into the black water where his sister had vanished, or where he thought she had. Behind him, the sound of footsteps emerged from the boathouse. They were slow at first, then quicker, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had decided to close the distance. Daniel didn't turn. He knew who it was, or at least, he thought he did. The smell of salt and rotting wood filled the air. The figure came closer, barefoot, her wet hair plastered against her pale face. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling not from fear, but from anger. "You weren't supposed to remember me." Daniel's heart pounded. "You're my sister," he said, but the words felt uncertain, fragile. The woman smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "They told you I drowned. They told you it was an accident. But Daniel, I never lived here. I was never born. And yet you still remember me." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the pier and the churning waves below. For a moment Daniel saw her reflection in the water, and beside it his own face, younger, terrified, the same as the night he had watched someone fall from this very spot. "I came back because you're the only one who still sees me," she said, stepping closer until her toes hung over the edge of the pier. "But if you keep remembering, they'll come for you too." Who Daniel demanded, but his voice broke. She tilted her head toward the town, toward the cluster of lights blinking faintly in the distance. Ashford doesn't like loose ends. A cold wind howled between the wooden beams, and the sound of the sea shifted less like waves, more like voices chanting something Daniel couldn't quite understand. Then, without warning, she stepped backward into the black water. There was no splash, no ripple, only empty space where she had been. Daniel rushed forward, leaning over the edge, but the sea below was calm, as if nothing had disturbed it. Behind him, the footsteps came again. Only this time they didn't stop. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, until Daniel could feel each one vibrating through the soaked timbers of the pier. He turned slowly, heart hammering, expecting to see her again. But it wasn't her. A tall man in a long oilskin coat emerged from the shadows, his face hidden under the brim of a fisherman's hat. Water dripped steadily from the hem of his coat, pooling at his boots, as though he had walked straight out of the ocean. "You've been looking where you shouldn't," the man said, his voice low and steady with the faint rasp of salt water in his throat. Daniel took a step back toward the edge. "She's my sister." The man shook his head slowly. "There was no sister, lad, just the town's mistake, and mistakes have to be cleaned up." Something about the way he said the town made Daniel shiver. It wasn't just a place, it sounded like an entity, something alive and watchful. "I saw her," Daniel insisted. "I remember her." "You can't tell me she—" "You remember because Ashford let you remember," the man interrupted, stepping closer. "But now Ashford's changing its mind. A sudden crash of waves hit the pier's supports, spraying cold water up between the planks. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small brass object, an old-fashioned ship's whistle. He raised it to his lips and blew, but no sound came out. And yet from the darkness beyond the pier, the water began to stir. First, a slow, deliberate swirl. Then shapes began to rise, tall, thin silhouettes that weren't quite human, their forms shifting and dripping, as if made entirely of sea-water. They surrounded the far end of the pier, cutting off any retreat. Daniel's breath came fast.
"What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head, the shadow under his hat revealing a faint, inhuman glint in his eyes. "We want you to forget, lad, just like the others." One of the watery figures stepped forward, the boards beneath it creaking but not breaking. It reached out with a hand-like shape, droplets falling to the pier with soft, rhythmic taps. Daniel backed away, feeling the edge at his heels. "I'm not going to forget her," he said, his voice trembling but steady enough to make the man pause. The man's grin was slow and deliberate. "Then you'll join her." Lightning ripped across the sky again, and in that instant Daniel saw the impossible dozens of faces in the water below, pale and wide-eyed, staring up at him. Some were strangers. One was hers. The watery hand closed around his wrist, and the chill that shot through him felt like his very blood was freezing. The figures began to pull.
The last thing Daniel heard before the ocean swallowed him was the man's voice, calm and certain. Ashford doesn't lose its secrets. The water slammed shut above his head. The surface was a silver smear, far above, glimmering faintly through the heavy dark water. Daniel kicked hard, dragging his sister with him, the muscles in his legs screaming as he fought against the weight pulling him down. But the moment he broke from the circle of pale-eyed figures, the water behind him erupted. They were following, not swimming, rushing like the current itself had chosen to give chase. Dozens of ghostly forms, their hair streaming like torn flags, mouths opening in silent hunger. Their eyes glowed brighter now, like beacons in the abyss. Daniel risked a glance back and wished he hadn't. Something else had joined the pursuit, something vast, formless and darker than the water itself. Its outline was impossible to comprehend, but its presence pressed on him like a weight against his ribs. It was the thing she had warned him about, the drowned heart of Ashford. His sister's grip tightened painfully. Daniel stopped. "You can't outswim it." "Yes, I can," he growled, refusing to look down. "We're getting out of here." A sudden blast of cold water slammed into him from behind, spinning him sideways. His sister didn't fight the pull, she was letting herself be taken. "Let go!" she screamed, and for a fraction of a second she sounded exactly like the girl he remembered. No, the silver light of the surface was closer now, so close his lungs remembered air. He powered upward with everything he had left. The current screamed in his ears, and the pale-eyed figures reached for his ankles, fingertips brushing skin. Then impact. He burst through the surface into the open night. The roar of the ocean replaced the crushing silence of the deep. Rain lashed his face, and the lights of Ashford Pier glimmered in the distance. He gasped, pulling his sister above the water. But she was gone. His hands closed around nothing but black, churning waves. From below, a soft glow shone for a moment, her eyes, watching him from the depths, before the sea swallowed it. Daniel screamed her name, but the only answer was the wind. Somewhere beneath him, the drowned town waited patient as the tide. The storm was in full fury by the time Daniel staggered onto the pier. His soaked clothes clung to his skin like a second weight, each breath coming in ragged gasps. The wooden planks beneath his feet groaned, the whole structure shivering with every wave that slammed against its supports. He didn't remember swimming the whole way, just a blur of salt rain and the desperate need to touch something solid. But now that he was here, something was wrong. The pier wasn't empty. Figures stood in a loose line along the edge, silhouettes against the swinging glow of the dock lamps. 10, maybe 12 of them, each unmoving, each facing him. As Daniel staggered closer, the rain momentarily cleared from his eyes, and he froze. They were all from Ashford. The old shopkeeper, with the milky eye, the boy who had once been his fishing partner, Mrs. Howell, from the post office. People he hadn't seen in years, people who were supposed to be dead. Their skin was pale as wax hair, dripping clothes, sodden and tattered. And their eyes, that same faint, unholy glow he'd seen under the water. "Welcome home, Daniel, Mrs. Howell," said her voice, carrying even through the storm. His stomach twisted. "Where is she?" he demanded, voice breaking. The shopkeeper stepped forward, and as he moved, seawater dripped from his mouth in a slow, steady trickle. "She's where she belongs. Where you belong." Daniel's pulse thudded against his skull. He glanced over his shoulder at the black sea, then back at the pale faces in front of him. Behind them, the town lights flickered in an unnatural rhythm, almost like breathing. "You went below," the boy said, his tone flat, but edged with something like accusation. "Now the cove will not let you go." Daniel backed up a step, the boards slick under his feet. He wasn't sure which was worse, diving back into the water or facing the drowned townsfolk that had once been his neighbors. The storm roared, and for a split second he thought he heard her voice in the wind. "Daniel, please." When he looked toward the sound, every figure on the pier was suddenly closer, crowding him in. Daniel's heels touched the very edge of the pier. Beyond him, the ocean he had just escaped churned in black fury. Before him, the line of drowned townsfolk closed in their silent steps in perfect sync with the crashing waves. Lightning split the sky, and in that flash, Daniel saw her Anna standing at the center of the group. Her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn, eyes glowing faintly like the rest. She looked exactly as she had the night she vanished, but something in her face was wrong. "Anna," he whispered, his voice shaking. Her lips parted. "I told you to stay away, Daniel." 1,000 questions tangled in his mind, but none could escape his mouth before the others began to hum, a low, droning vibration that seemed to rise from the boards beneath his feet. The sound rattled his bones. "You were never supposed to remember," Anna said, her voice steady, now strange and cold. "You weren't supposed to come back to Ashford." The rain pelted his face as the humming grew louder, pressing into his skull. In the flickering docklight, Daniel saw more figures emerging from the waves, climbing onto the pier, pale faces, all with that same faint glow. And then it hit him. They weren't here for revenge, they were here for reunion. Anna stepped forward and reached out her hand. Her fingers were icy against his skin. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered. Daniel's mind screamed at him to pull away, to dive back into the sea, to run. But his body didn't obey. The pier, the storm, the wind, all of it faded into silence as the figures pressed closer. In that final moment, Daniel understood the truth. Anna had never been taken from Ashford. She had become Ashford, and now so would he. The last thing he saw was her smile, soft, almost loving, before the water swallowed them both, and the pier stood empty under the flickering lights.